Saludos y bienvenidos a un episodio escalofriante de Genre Grinder. I hope you enjoyed the cumbia version of the theme song I threw together there. Please welcome returning guest, Kristine Fisher. Say hello, Kristine.
Hi, Kristine.
Today we're talking about a specific brand of Latin American ghost story, the legend of La Llorona, the Crying Woman. This tale actually predates Mexican culture. It's pre-colonial. There are Guatemalan, Venezuelan versions, as well as the Mexican-American version, which is the one I heard as a white kid growing up in southern Arizona. That story involves a woman who killed her children and now goes looking for new children to drown. And it was similar to the story of El Cucuy, that is a warning to children to not wander off alone, especially not at night, and especially not around bodies of water, because it always involved drowning. Mm-hmm. When we're researching this episode, I discovered that version has very little in common with the original. So, what does La Llorona, the myth and legend, mean to you?
I should first really preface it by saying I'm the product of a mom who's Spanish, Mexican, and Irish, and a dad who's white by way of Ireland and Norway. And it was basically used as like a disciplinary tool to scare me into behaving or going to bed at night, and an added sense of security that I would not misbehave or else someone would come to get me. So it was the disciplining of fear in order to make me comply and not be kidnapped.
Yeah, and the thing, and for me is that my parents never disciplined that way, but the story was presented to us because I went to a magnet school program that was really into cultural enrichment. Mm-hmm. So the whole point of the program was, as a white kid from one side of town, I was supposed to be learning about what it was like to be Hispanic kids on the other side of town. Right. So they would tell us this story during Halloween, mm-hmm. and tell it to us saying this was a way of making children behave. Mm-hmm. But my little brain was like, so what you're saying is this is true and it will happen and I need to watch out. And there was like a part of me that was like, but it happened in Mexico.
That's not too far away.
Yeah, so like I got at least 90 miles to run away from this. But yeah, that's part of why when we met, I was already into Dia de los Muertos stuff, mm-hmm. because it was just something we did in school. Yes. It wasn't necessarily that I was taking it as a cultural thing, but just as this is something from my childhood, that we had these sugar skulls and stuff.
Correct. And in my way of growing up, it was a way of honoring the dead, as the day before or after Halloween, where you would take care of the graves of your ancestors. Another aspect of La Llorona is that I couldn't speak her name to invoke her. So it's like you better not, come, or else La Llorona's gonna come and get you. And I would try to think against it, or try not to say her name in fear of invoking her and her coming to get me.
It's definitely a very Bloody Mary thing.
Yes.
At least stateside.
Yeah, I mix the ethos or the mythos of both things a lot.
Yeah. So that's a good way to think of it, as I think most people listening would know the Bloody Mary. Mm-hmm. And they would have heard of La Llorona because there's a lot of movies based on La Llorona, especially recently. Mm-hmm. But we're going to look at older movies, mostly Mexican-made.
Yes.
And so we don't really need to go too deeply into the lore here, because the first movie we're going to talk about, La Llorona, 1933, directed by Ramón Peón, is sort of a description of both things. And I want to quickly say, this is our first time recording and in our new apartment. We have 2 microphones going, so there's going to be some feedback from the road outside. When I record by myself, I can be aimed away from the road, but it doesn't work that way when there's 2 of us.
Yeah, I'm facing the window.
Yeah, so please excuse the street sounds. I'll try to cut as many of them out as I can while I'm editing, but there'll be some street sounds in this episode. Anyway, so this was, Ramón Peón, who's a Cuban transplant known for directing some of the earliest Mexican films, not just Mexican horror films. We watched a version on YouTube that had kind of iffy subtitles, but all the other versions I found had no subtitles. There's currently a Blu-ray from Indicator in the UK, and it's a limited edition and already out of print as far as I could tell, so there wasn't enough time to get that. And this isn't the first Mexican sound film, but it was made only a year or two after the first Mexican sound film, and it was the first sound horror film, though it's not entirely a horror film. This is told mostly in flashback. It has a framing device. In a way, it's a proto anthology horror movie because it has a framing device, more than one story, and there's a sort of moral to the whole thing.
Correct.
It's not an ironic moral like you'd see in an EC comic. A framing device is modern day Mexico within modern day Mexico, and it's the child's fifth birthday, my bad. And there's a man, they're having a party, and there's a man in a black executioner hood who keeps listening in. And the party kind of has this whole thing about superstition. There's a character who's very upset about there being 13 place settings and stuff like that. And so then we get flashbacks to two different versions of the story. One is, they're not clear in this version that she's an indigenous or not woman, but I think the idea is that she's an indigenous woman who enters a relationship with is he a viceroy in this one? Yeah, he's some sort of very high up there, high-ranking conquistador era figure. And they have 2 children. He rejects her, and so she kills herself and the child.
Correct.
And there's this whole thing about there being a specific ceremonial dagger involved.
Yes.
And then after she kills them, she becomes the wailing spirit. And then we get a second version that goes back further, and it involves a definitely indigenous woman, Mexican woman, who I'm going to guess Mayan because that's what we would.
They're in the area.
Yeah, Aztec Mayan. They take her children, so she becomes the wailing spirit to avenge that.
Yes.
And that folds in on the framing story that this family, whichever version of the story is true, this family has been cursed by that.
Yes.
And so there's a sort of cabal out to continue this curse, and they want to make sure the now 5-year-old child dies.
And then it's the uncle of the woman who's like a doctor or professor or some sort of learned man who tells this to some sort of guy that lives with him or is involved with the family. It has a lot to do with both superstition and family curses and things being passed down from generation to generation. And avoiding bringing shame to your family and avoiding death by suicide. Because if you die by suicide, you're doomed to wander through purgatory and not go to heaven. And somehow that will pass down to your living family, and they'll be cursed in some way.
Right.
And then it seemed like it worked through the ceremonial dagger being passed down, and La Llorona kind of whispering into the ears of people who are like service staff for this family. Like, you must, I deem you to be the enacting my will upon their children.
Yeah. And the movie is interesting thing to me as a movie person, is it doesn't really commit to any specific genre just because I don't think that's how you did that back in those days. No. So the last part of the movie is almost a cop procedural where the police come in because the kid's been taken and they have to figure out what happens. And then they find a whole bunch of hidden passageways. I also was surprised how little this took from Todd Browning's Dracula, which the George Melford version would have been released in Mexico. There was that Spanish shot version of Dracula that was shot at night using the same sets as the Todd Browning movie.
Correct. Yeah.
And so I knew it was a hit out there, and Dracula and James Whale's Frankenstein, the Universal movies, were had such an impact on the world that I just sort of assumed this coming out a couple years later was just going to look exactly like that. But it really is its own thing. It has some gothic parts, like
yes.
the hidden passages look gothic, but it's it's still interesting that I would almost just barely categorize it as a horror movie. It's almost like
It's a cautionary tale.
Yeah, and then parts of it are like a docudrama. So yeah, it's an interesting movie from this standpoint. I don't know if everybody would necessarily like it, but there's something about an industry trying to figure out what makes Mexican film different from Hollywood film.
And how to portray this ghost story in a kind of honorable way and in a way that will teach other people not to do something.
Yeah. And artistically, it's most of it is like costume drama. The flashbacks to the sort of Elizabethan. I'm gonna guess that's the era.
Yeah.
That looks very swashbuckly, like to the point where there's really elongated sword fights that don't really serve the plot very much. No. But it's just sort of to have fun and swashbuckle, I guess.
That reminds me about how the Santo movie is going to do that later, but with wrestling instead.
But with wrestling instead, yeah. So maybe they are sort of setting that up. That's a good point. But then when they have the flashback, the further flashback to the Conquistador era, they tell the story about how this boy was taken. That's right, it was one child, not two.
That's okay.
It was taken and brought up by the colonizers.
Yes.
And that one's super abstract, like a stage play with almost no background. And so they're really, Peón is really hedging his bets in a way, but I think it's more like feeling out what Mexican sound cinema is going to be. Yeah. Another thing I noted is it does acknowledge the fact that this is pre-colonial, not just by showing an indigenous person, but there's the ring, this cursed ring, and the ceremonial knife itself.
Yes.
Both have, it's either Aztec or, what is Olmec?
Olmec, yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of an Olmec face. So they are acknowledging this is pre-Christian as far as Mexico is concerned. And really my only personal other note on this one was that I really like the wipes between scenes. It was sort of a clock hand turning. Anyway, yeah, really cool wipes for the period of film.
The other notes, besides suicidal death, besides staying in your lane familial wise and not do anything outside of your social standing, was the fact that humiliation within a family or bringing your family names down is like a social death. And having a child out of wedlock was a big one, especially when I was growing up. If I would have had a child out of wedlock, like a teenage pregnancy, I would have been disowned. That was an open, disciplining thing that my mom made very clear to my sister and I.
And that's in the first flashback, the whole idea. I mean, it's not exactly, this version is not very sympathetic to the woman in the first flashback who kills her children.
Isn't there like a trial where they're like, no, you get out of here. You're like a shame to this family.
Yeah, and they try to just ditch her, yeah. Well, and it actually, that sort of treatment of that character changes throughout these movies that we watched. I think that they're a little more sympathetic to her. They're definitely sympathetic to the indigenous woman in the other flashback.
Yes.
She does nothing wrong and deserves her vengeance or whatever.
And I think the person who was kind of like caring for her and like drying her tears turned out to be the woman who was a maid or a service person for the household, going on and on and on.
Yeah.
That's how she got like an acolyte or like an Igor that would prove that the curse would go on and the firstborn child would be killed.
Yeah, that's another thing, is that the supernatural stuff, a lot of it is just discussed in the flashbacks. It seems like the actual events are not supernatural, but occult.
Yes.
Yeah, that's an interesting difference. Now let's move on to the next one, which La Llorona, 1960, directed by René Cardona, who is another Cuban-born filmmaker, who was, years before this, he made a full-color Santa Claus movie, which is featured in Mystery Science Theater. His real claim to fame is, unfortunately, Night of the Bloody Apes, which is a cult movie that's sort of a goofy luchador horror hybrid, which we'll get into later. But it infamously included footage from an actual heart transplant, which ended up getting it on the UK Video Nasties list, like 2 decades later. And that movie was a pseudo remake of Fernando Mendez's groundbreaking, very important 1956 horror movie, Ladrón de Cadáveres. Cadavers. Cadavers.
This is like someone listening to someone else
Ladrón.
order from a Mexican restaurant and just going, okay.
Anyway, this is, and then he remade this using this Mendez's film and his own luchador movie, Las Luchadoras contra el Medición Asesino, the wrestling women versus the killer doctor. Anyway, despite this pedigree for shit, his version of La Llorona is a standard fare melodrama, and actually has some really good performances and some really attractive gothic sequences, I'd say.
I love the intro being kind of like new age European film, driving on this road, the under bridges, and just talking about the limbo between life and death, the kind of gray area where La Llorona lives. And the theme I really got from this one is how if you have mixed race parentage, you're almost guaranteed to go crazy. You're going to have some sort of madness in your adult life.
And it does, and that opening you're talking about is almost like a Mexican triptych.
Yeah.
It's like it like feels like come visit the beauty of Mexico, but they're actually warning us about the horrors of the afterlife.
In this town, there's La Llorona. People try not to talk about it.
This version has to have been inspired by the 1933 one we just talked about. It's not a remake, but it has a similar structure and the basic plot beginning in the modern day with strife of a wealthy family cursed by legend. It seems like they had to have borrowed that from the other one. Yes. But this one, instead of starting with a birthday, it starts with a wedding.
Yes.
And then has a montage of dates flying by as the first child is born and approaches its 5th year. And in this version, the mother is incredibly overprotective to the chagrin of her husband, who threatens to divorce her if she won't stop not letting the kid be a kid, basically.
And to go out with him socially.
Right, he wants to have a... I mean, he's being a dick about it, but she is... I mean, if we're pretending there's no such thing as the supernatural, she is being ridiculously overprotective, especially because they're rich and have staff and shit.
That's the bind when, like, men and women of Mexican, Hispanic heritage, when they settle down. A woman either has to be domestic, extremely motherly and maternal, or be the kind of person who gets pretty for her husband. They go on very nice dates.
So this woman's... they actually drive home the point of how protective she is in an early scene where this kid is wrapped in a winter coat in warm weather because she's afraid he's going to get sick.
And then he walks forward. You're making him sweaty.
Yeah.
And then not too long after that, I'm gonna divorce you if you keep on doing
things
like this.
And then there's a sad part where she's just locked herself in a room with the kid and is just sitting over him as he sleeps. And then this anger on the father's part leads her dad, who I guess lives with them because it's a big estate of some kind.
Yes.
He might be visiting.
And I think he's like a historian because he's writing like stuff about Egyptology.
Yeah. He says, let me tell you why my daughter's acting this way. And so like in the first movie, there's a flashback to, this is what our family goes through. And this time we cut back and forth instead of telling the whole story the whole way through.
Yes. And I really connected it to being like The Princess Bride, where the man is like Fred Savage's character. He's just kind of bored, sort of listening to the professor or the old man tell the story, and gradually he's kind of like on the edge of his seat, like, and then what happens?
Yeah, that's a good.
He starts to see his own involvement in the story.
Yeah, and then this version of it is sort of mixing. It's making it clear that the woman who is an indigenous woman who has a child willingly with a Spanish. He is the viceroy, correct?
He is like, he works for the viceroy.
He works for viceroy, so he's just one level down.
And he's one out of two Nunos, or Nunos.
Nunos, yeah.
We come across another Nunos in a later story or a later movie.
So it must have been some version of this story involved that name. Anyway, so he has a child with this woman willingly, and he just sort of leaves her in a castle and then rejects her because...
And he doesn't want to kiss the baby.
Yeah, well, the baby looks too native.
Yes.
Which, is making, like, unlike the other movie, it's making this very clear that this is about rejecting mixed race kids, like you said, or mixed race people. And there's another time skip, and now she has 2 children, so she's slowly going mad because he's avoiding her, and even sending underlings to try to
placate her. But she's like, where is he? How far is he away? Has he talked about me? Does he want to know where his children is? And she eventually finds out that he's going to get married to a far fairer blonde woman who doesn't look anything like her. And doesn't have mixed blood or is a native born.
There's after she finds this out, there's a really interesting scene that's the most, I would say, experimental thing in a really pretty straightforward melodrama, where she's confronted by her heritage quite literally.
Yes.
A bunch of native people kind of come out of nowhere, and they do a traditional dance, which I think the correct term here is a mitote, with the shells around the feet, and they do a dance around her, and it's her being confronted by her heritage, and she's either rejecting it or she's misreading what they're saying.
And this is after she left the party where she cursed the generations that are going to come of the marriage of Nuno and the blonde lady.
And it's in front of a church when it happens too. So it's definitely an issue of her being stuck between these two worlds.
Yes.
And instead of just going on with her life, like maybe I think the native ghosts or whatever we're trying to get her to do, she decides to kill the kids. Yes. And then they sentence her to a public hanging. It's again, she kills them with a knife. Again, drowning has nothing to do with anything.
Not yet.
Which was the way I had always heard it was about a woman drowning her children. So it was interesting that we're already 2 movies in and there's only knives involved.
And then afterwards, her ghost, after she dies of the hanging and after she does the whole curse, for some reason her ghost is saying, mis hijos, as though she wants to acknowledge her children. Not out of regret, but just calling out to them.
And when she gets hanged, there's a really nice touch where her dangling feet dissolve into the pendulum of a grandfather clock.
In the present day.
Yeah, that's a really good shot. Then at that point, they go back to the modern day, and the young husband is thoroughly disturbed. And that's when it really becomes a horror movie instead of a melodrama, because spooky things happening, lights going off, doors slamming. Haunted house things.
And then the mom or the wife has like a change of heart. Suddenly she really wants to go out and really wants him to hire a nanny to take care of the boy.
Yes.
She's suddenly okay with it.
And so like literally that's like the end of movie BBA. Yes. And then there's like almost a completely new movie where Lila Llorona, played by the same actress from the flashbacks, appears in their modern day and takes a nanny job. So like this ghostly Mary Poppins.
That wants to kill this.
She's like a demon.
This kid is a brat, by the way.
Yeah. Well, in part because he's been coddled to the point of suffocation. Yes. I don't feel too bad for him. But yeah, she's like the evil Mary Poppins. And she says at one point that she only has a few hours in corporeal form to enact her curse.
It feels like days.
Yeah, hours seem to be measured in days. And then either that or she sort of forgets. But she's really determined to kill the kids with accidents.
Yes.
The kid with accidents. Like drowning in a bathtub, and she plays with his ball next to a busy street. She lets him run with scissors, and he trips and falls, but he doesn't fall on them.
Tries to get something out of a window.
Yeah, it's like a flower in a window.
Yeah, she's like, just go get it.
And so yeah, she's really awful at murdering children is kind of the what's going on.
And then she kind of reverts back visually to her older self whenever she looks at a painting of Nuno that they have inside the house.
Yeah.
Or when the kid is about to die, she just suddenly goes haggard, like, oh, Here it comes. Oh.
Yeah, and so she just sort of reverts to being a stabbing ghost, but she's spent too much time fucking around.
And then time runs out.
And time runs out and she just dissipates. And so nothing really saves the kid other than her own lack of attention, I guess. The parents never really seem to understand what's happening until it's almost too late.
Yes.
This third part reminds me of a movie that actually came out later called The Nanny with Bette Davis. That's a Hammer horror film.
Was it haxploitation or no?
It was sort of haxploitation, yeah. I actually had never seen it. I watched it at your dad's house one time when I was in Arizona and you weren't.
Painfully loud volume, I assume.
No, he was asleep, so I watched it at a normal volume.
Interesting.
But yeah, I had never seen it, and it's a nanny who's insane and a killer, but not evil, and she is compelled to drown a little boy in the bathtub and thinks she has. And so I have no idea if it seems unlikely that Hammer people, the UK people, had any knowledge of this, but they might have had knowledge of La Llorona. But again, the closest we've gotten to the version I know is that she does at one point try to drown the little boy, but it's just one of like 4 different accidents she tries to put together. It's not really a theme. Yeah, so just like movie trivia stuff. The actor who plays the Viceroy's underling in flashbacks, Eduardo Fajardo, he's a Spanish actor, but he's in a lot of Italian westerns. So I knew him. He appears in Sergio Corbucci's original Django, which then anybody who was in Django got 13,000 other Italian horror or Western jobs. But he's also in the Mercenary and Companeros, both by Corbucci, playing sort of the same character. And then Mauricio Garces, who plays the husband, can be seen in Jano Urreta's wacky Mexican horror classic, The Brainiac, known in Spanish as El Barón de Terror, which was released the following year, which was if we were just covering Mexican horror in general, which we had talked about, we would have to have watched that movie, but it has nothing to do with La Llorona, so we skipped it for this time.
Fair enough.
So that brings us to Curse of the Crying Woman, in Spanish, La Maldición de la Llorona.
AKA Black Sunday Light.
Yeah, and so this movie was made in 1961, just a year later, but it didn't get released until 1963 is what I'm reading. That's why it was confusing. So if you're looking into these movies, this one can either be listed as Curse of the Crying Woman 1961 or 1963. This one has multiple DVD releases. The previous one we just talked about, you found a version with subtitles on YouTube. I could not find it. So there is a version with subtitles of the 1960 version. This one's directed by Rafael Baledón, who is an actor turned director who continued working right up until his death in 1994. He was important to Mexican horror of this era because he had made the year before this The Hell of Frankenstein, which was released in most Spanish-speaking countries as Orlok el Infierno de Frankenstein. I don't know how well Italian horror films did in Mexico, but like you said, this movie directly references Mario Bava's Black Sunday.
In its poster and in the actual movie.
Yeah. So that was released in August of 1961. So, I mean, he might have just seen it and started grabbing stuff from it, but the coincidences are too specific.
Visuals.
Yeah. I mean, the other one had some stuff you could attach to Bava, but, I mean, obviously not. But this one, there's vaguer references, like the opening is really the Bava part, where there's people riding through spooky stage set in a horse-drawn carriage, and you can tell it's a stage, and it has the same layering effects that Bava did. But what really really pushes it is that we have a spooky woman introduced holding the leashes of very large dogs, which is exactly how Barbara Steele is introduced. The present day version of Barbara Steele is introduced in that movie in Black Sunday. I suppose La Llorona has 3 dogs, and Barbara Steele only had 2.
That's true.
So she wins. And in this case, the dogs actually do appear and serve a purpose later in the story, whereas in Black Sunday, they're just there because it looks cool. Yes. They never appear again. This one also has more secret passages. in a way that is more Black Sunday like than Cat and the Canary. Like Cat and the Canary has this sort of Scooby Doo quality to the secret passages, and Black Sunday has more of a there's pomp and circumstance to the secret passages. And then other things I'm pretty sure he was the director was inspired by were House of Wax, and then the Hammer version of Dracula by Terrence Fisher, which everybody was inspired by, including Bava.
Which one of them had the person locked away in the tower? Any of them?
So the interesting thing about that is that actually reminded me most of Roger Corman's Pit and the Pendulum stuff. A lot of the way the visuals were set up. There wasn't. It's actually the opposite in that, where they go down instead of up.
Right.
But it really
But there is a witch in the basement.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that I don't think it's possible they could have taken that, or either way. I think that was one of those cases where they just came to the same conclusion, because Pit and the Pendulum was released basically the same year.
Ah.
And I don't think Corman was that aware of Mexican horror, especially since this one wasn't released till 1963, so Corman would have not known it at all. Yeah. But this one is so outwardly gothic, and it owes its debt to European people in particular, some Hollywood. That there's Bava, there's James Whale, and then the music is even very Bernard Herrmann-esque stuff.
And then I immediately noticed that the wail of La Llorona, or the wail of the witch, was like a saw being played.
Yeah, it was a saw. I'm guessing they couldn't afford a
theremin.
A real theremin, so they had to go with the saw. There's a coachman who warns them not to go to a mansion because it's cursed, which is straight out of every Gothic horror movie. There's a disfigured servant, an Igor type. There's cobwebs in every room. There's rats and bats everywhere. It's very European Gothic. And then I think the way the scares are set up remind me of William Castle movies. So a little on the cheesy side, a little on the boo. Before people really figured out jump scares. I'm sure they were plenty scary back in the day, but... And then there is some comic relief, but they die almost immediately.
Yeah,
there's just like
really funny.
A fat guy in the coach that keeps making dumb jokes, and then all those people are killed by the dogs. They're not even characters later on in the movie.
They're just more reasons for people not to go to the house.
Not to go to the house. And I do think that it's possible that Corman inspired it, because there's a little bit of Corman's version of House of Usher, and the way
it ends. I mean, the house falls apart.
Yeah, the house falls apart, and it's actually a couple going to this house with their mysterious aunt. Yes. Or is she an aunt?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep, Aunt Selma.
Instead of just a guy going to visit his lover and her brother. But it's a similar situation where somebody comes to figure out what the fuck's going on. But it's also that whole classic haunted house setup of like, we're going to go visit the weird aunt that we know nothing about.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised about that.
And then not notice that shit's going down until it's almost too late. Yeah. So yeah, it's a little Universal Monsters, little Scooby-Doo, little Mario Bava. Looks good. I thought it looked nice.
I put down that Aunt Selma was influenced to become a kind of witch vampiress by her coming across the dead body of Madame Marina, or she was kind of a medicine woman, cum witch, and she wants to kind of resurrect or honor Madame Marina in order to be bestowed like immortal life, constant, the ability to have witchcraft and to stay young.
Yeah. So it's someone who has discovered this lineage. She's trying to use the La Llorona curse, in effect, to forward herself. Instead of it being, we have to avoid this curse that our family has, it has to be, it's more like the family's forgotten about this curse and she's discovered it and realizes she can use it to do witchy things.
And then she tries to convert her niece to also do it, and she makes it known that because you're turning 25 soon, that's the ideal year, and the year where this is going to just happen to you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it.
Which is also similar to Black Sunday, come to think of it, which is about resurrected witches / vampires. They're never really clear in Black Sunday what they are, but there's a whole modern day version versus the evil past version that's coming back. And I think that's part of why I enjoyed it so much, is because I like all that old Gothic stuff. Like, even the villains are this sort of mix of universal monsters. The witch can turn into a backlight creature. She has no reflection, and which is a contagious element of this curse, actually, is that you lose. They're sort of vampires. And she has the fashion sense of Dracula.
Yes, for sure.
And there's actually even a scene, I didn't even point this out to you when we were watching it, but there's a scene where she walks through a spider's web without disturbing it.
Correct.
There's a thing that happens between a cut in the original Dracula that's almost a subconscious thing for the viewer, where Dracula is walking forward, there's a web in front of him, we cut back to Jonathan
Harker.
and then we cut back and he's walked through without touching it. So yeah, they're taking that by and then we have she's black magic and sacrifices, and the town rose up against her, which makes her a little bit like Elizabeth Bathory, more than any existing version of La Llorona. This is one where it kind of feels like they crammed the La Llorona thing into just to give it some Mexican flavor.
Yes.
But her ancient ancestor dark magic thing is very much like the universal mummy.
Yes.
And she has the assistance of basically Igor, and then she keeps her husband in the attic.
Yeah, her husband tried to keep her down, apparently, so she keeps him up in the attic, very much like Grace Poole in the novelization of Jane Eyre. You want to keep your past or your former lover hidden away.
Yeah, it's like the opposite, where like in Jane Eyre, he's keeping her back.
Yes.
It's like a gender swap version. But he's also basically a wolfman.
Yes.
On top of he's kind of a Frankenstein and a wolfman in one. It's very funny how they just are like threw every universal monster into the stew. And so yeah, it's all this big setup, and the thing I like a lot is that the younger woman does begin to feel herself embodied with this evil spirit. And there's a point where she almost kills a coachman and then stops herself, and then she realizes she doesn't have reflection, and her husband is super supportive during all this. He just breaks the mirror. He's like, fine, just don't look at yourself, you're fine.
And I think it's through that she breaks the curse, because she realizes she loves her husband so much and wants him to be alive, and through that love the house falls apart and then the curse is lifted.
The husband, who seems like kind of a lesser character, like his only real purpose is that he's so handsome and loving that it can break a curse. He's the biggest star in the whole thing. Abel Salazar. He was the producer of this film and the star, and he was the guy behind a bunch of Mexican horror films, which he appeared and produced. El Vampiro, The Vampire's Coffin, The Brainiac, which we just talked about, and The Witch's Mirror. So it's interesting that he, instead of casting himself as an outright hero, he just casts himself as so fucking gorgeous and sweet and perfect of a man that he can break a curse. And the actress who plays Amelia. It's just Amelia?
Yeah.
I was trying to
Amelia.
Spanish it up. Amelia. She's played by Rosita Arnaz, who's a Venezuelan actress who was and appeared in all three Aztec mummy movies. She kind of played the same character, honestly. I haven't seen all of those, but I guess another thing I would say that's not really necessarily thematic is it's pretty gruesome. I was surprised. It was kind of bloody. The sort of corpse is a really cool, like, it's tied to a wheel, but it's rotted in a way that it's sort of part of the wheel, and it's been impaled.
Yes, with a spear.
With a spear, and it's very like Spear of Longinus type stuff.
Yes.
Where the curse will be completely enacted if the right person pulls the spear out
At the correct time.
At the correct time, it has to. So there's actually really suspenseful scene of her pulling it out, the husband saying please don't, the witch saying do it, and there's just bong, because you need 12 bongs for midnight.
Yes.
And like it's like you find yourself counting them and going, oh, if she pulls it out, no.
And you kind of see the face of the woman behind the skeleton.
And which is a good special effect for the time. It's got a good ending where the manor crumbles that they put a lot of effort into. They made a pretty nice model that collapses, and then on the sets they have these huge set pieces coming down. And the thing is that Amelia tries to save her aunt after all this shit. She tries to help her run out of the collapsing building because she's a good person. And then the Frankenwolf husband shows up and strangles her to death. She doesn't make it.
Here's what you get for keeping me up there.
Yeah, and then they get crushed by the whole thing. Yeah, and she doesn't try to stop her monster uncle from killing her aunt. But I mean, it's a silly movie, and it really does feel like they crammed La Llorona in there after the fact because they wanted it to have a definitive. This is one that I didn't want. There's a lot more writing on this one, and I maybe should have read up on if that was the plan, was to just do a European Hollywood style movie, and they just picked the La Llorona as
kind of localized.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but it's at the very least it's a good looking Gothic horror movie from the era. I thought.
I agree.
We'll skip up about 10 years to 1974 with Santo y Mantequilla Napoles in The Revenge of the Crying Woman. This is on Tubi with a bunch of other Santo movies. If you are interested in exploring Santo movies.
And don't mind a really weird dub.
And that's the thing, is that I'm going to go, these are really awful recent dubs. I tried to see exactly when they were done, and it seems like there was a remastering of a bunch of them, because up until pretty recently, only like 2 or 3 of the, how many, I wrote down how many there are, the 2 or 3 of the dozens and dozens of Santo movies had ever been either dubbed or subtitled. So it seems like some company who meant well went in there and dubbed them very badly.
Bless their hearts.
But it is sort of the only way to see it if you don't speak English, is apparent. Well, it seems like there's a UK release that actually has subtitles in the original Spanish language, so that might be the way to go if you can. Yeah, they give Mantequilla Napoles a couple funny lines that aren't at his own expense, but it's kind of Speedy Gonzales bullshit for a lot of it. I have a short history here of professional wrestling in Mexico, just to sort of set up, because we're not doing a full, luchador episode here, which was another thing we talked about. I'm kind of glad we didn't, because these movies are all the same. I have to say it. According to the book Mondo Macabro by Pete Toombs, professional wrestling was introduced to Mexico in the early 30s by promoter Salvador Luteroth, who imported the concept of masked wrestlers from the United States. Lucha Libre became an extremely popular spectator sport, and the mythic aspects of the masks were developed and amplified. In some matches, the loser is forced to unmask, a step which effectively ended his career, at least under that name, since his face were now publicly owned. It's similar to what we see in our pro wrestling to this day, and I'm sure they still
With
have.
the I Quit matches.
Yeah.
And the Royal Rumble.
Yeah.
Bringing it down to like one person.
As far as movies go, luchador movies and comic books started in the early 50s. And El Santo, Career as a Wrestler, dates back to the 40s. The first movie to combine all the elements of the luchador, which Pete Toombs counts as masked wrestling and crime fighting, Santo himself, and horror elements, was 1961's Santo contra los Zombies, The Invasion of the Zombies, by Benito Alazraqui. This one is that we watched came out quite a bit later in the cycle. And it's known in Mexico as La Venganza de la Llorona, meaning there was no mention of Santo in the original title. Mm-hmm. They just would have kind of assumed, I guess. Miguel M. Delgado directed this, and at least 3 other Santo movies. There's my number, 53 total Santo movies. His other ones were Santo versus Frankenstein's daughter, Santo and the Blue Demon versus Dracula and the Wolfman, and Santo and Blue Demon versus Dr. Frankenstein. And I'm saying at least 3 others because not all of them have Santo's name on IMDb, and I honestly am not sure.
You don't want to take that deep.
Yeah, I mean, I could dig through every single one of his movies and figure out if Santo appeared in any of them.
Or a blue team.
Yeah, but all of these were pretty late in Santo's run. It was already starting to... It's like Godzilla. It was starting to lose its momentum and really be aimed mostly at children at this point. This is like the Destroy All Monsters and Son of Godzilla era. This one, it really seems like it... I'm going to guess that the first 2 we covered were popular because this one's sort of... seems like they tried to take the structure of those first 2 La Lloronas, the 1961 and the 1933 one, and apply it to their Santo formula. Is kind of what it felt like.
It really begins with, like you said, the Santo movies being directed toward kid. It begins with essentially the firstborn kid trope, and his family and his little sister, who's just so gosh darn cute, watching Santo matches. I think there's about 3 or 4 of them in total that we kind of see little bits and pieces of as being described on television. And he's kind of like saying, "Oh, Santo, do this. Santo's my favorite wrestler." So it's right away the kid is like a fan of wrestling, and that's how much will be involved in the film.
Yeah, he's definitely an audience surrogate for children. He's like a Robin. And so, yeah, it starts with the historian, a couple of historians, but one of them is the grandfather of these children. They ask Santo straight up to desecrate a grave. And he says, nah.
I'm too proud to do that.
And then they're like, but there's a treasure map. He's like, I don't care about treasure. He's like, but we could donate the money to Children's Hospital. And then Santo gets
And
interested.
then he turns around, changes his mind.
Yeah. And he goes and gets Napoles to go with him because apparently this version of the real-life boxer is into ghosts.
Yeah,
so
I just want to see that lady.
Yeah.
It's not about the money.
Yeah.
It's not about getting the medallion. It's about seeing the lady.
So they go into, there's this whole set piece where they go into a cave. I'm getting ahead of myself. There is another flashback where...
It's fast.
Yeah, it's a really fast one. And this is the version where La Llorona is rejected by the father of her children when he leaves for a Spanish aristocrat. This time they're all blonde, so it doesn't seem to be an indigenous woman.
No. She's not being, pushed away for another blonde woman because she herself is blonde.
Yeah. And she poisons herself and the children. There's no stabbing. Or again, no drowning. We still don't have drowning. The Santo part comes in because she's hidden the treasure in order to frame her ex-lover for her murder.
And it's made very, very quick, brief mention of that this is the Viceroy's goal, so it's another tie-in for a Viceroy.
Yeah. And so it really does feel like a compacted version of what the story we already heard. And then also it ties into the 1961/63 version because she involves a witch. The witch is the
witch
one.
Gives her the poison.
Specifically a Satan worshiper, actually. Not just a witch.
And she has to sign over a document giving her soul to the devil in blood.
Yeah. The reason the curse happens is because the guy is acquitted of her murder. And so she's pissed off, and she has promised that the guy will be punished, but then he's acquitted in a court of law, which we don't see, we just hear that he was acquitted.
Yeah.
And so part of her blood pact is that she gets to come back as a ghost and curse his family for generations, basically. So it seems like the witch didn't give the right information. It kind of feels like the witch did this on purpose somehow. They don't specify, but I mean, if I was the witch, I would be interested in this going for generations. Anyway, so then we go back and Santo's legacy as a character kind of comes in because the professor has hot and busty nieces.
That's true.
Who are into him and follow along. One of them's wearing a Roach Ribbit Frog Club t-shirt.
Pretty awesome.
We looked up marijuana reference that I'm not sure the Studio New was in a
I don't
marijuana
think they meant
reference.
that to happen.
And then they're also followed by gangsters who kind of come out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
But if we would have been paying attention to Santo movies for our entire childhoods, it'd be like, yeah, these are the dudes that fight Santo. It makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I think he says kind of briefly, people in the mob want to try to kill me.
Yeah.
And they also happen to have an interest in the medallion.
Yeah, and so yeah, they have one scene at the beginning where we find out that these guys are interested in the medallion, and then it kind of feels like they come out of nowhere after that. But there's precedent. So they are followed into La Llorona's lair by the mobsters and the nieces. And they get the locket with the thing, and they go, and the nieces get lost, and they don't even know the nieces are in there, and they rebury everything, and the nieces get chased around by La Llorona's zombie. She's more of a zombie than a ghost this time,
Maybe
at least in
even
this
a
part.
mummy. She's kind of
Yeah,
mortified.
they go in to get them, and they escape, but they leave the door open, and so she gets out, and then they go back to the house, and there's they keep cutting away for wrestling matches. And it's funny because they're all on TV. So it's like either Santo or Napoles has a match, boxing or wrestling match. And so the kids and the one who didn't go will watch it on TV.
That's right.
Because La Llorona's escaped, Santo and Napoles agreed to guard the children.
Oh, God, that weird part.
And the kid, there's this whole long sequence where the kid thinks it's a dream and convinces them to have a wrestling match in their garden.
Because a Santo would never fight a boxer.
Yeah.
So he stages a dream fight.
Yeah, and this boy who's really large for a 5-year-old, he's got to be at least 13.
The little girl is probably 5.
Yeah, the boy is giant. It actually ends up serving the plot. It's the one time a wrestling scene serves the plot because by letting them go outside, La Llorona can get him, and they have to.
And she emits some sort of La Llorona fog that he walks into, and then it's the next day.
Yeah.
And he's still alive.
Yeah, they kind of forgot some moments. And then we get a version of the 1960 movie where La Llorona sort of embodies the image of a modern living woman.
Next door neighbors.
Who's their neighbor.
And then somehow the witch is also back.
Yeah, and they
age.
They never explain, the witch just seems to not age.
Right.
They don't really explain what her stake is in this either. But I think the idea is it's something similar to the previous movie where she stands to gain some sort of power out of this curse. Mm-hmm. But they don't quite.
And she's not even reminding La Llorona of what she needs to do. She's just kind of doesn't say anything. And then also at the same time, the zombie mummy La Llorona still exists.
The best I could figure out from that is that during the day she's lady. Mm-hmm. And tries to get the kids to do stupid things. Mm-hmm. And at night she becomes the mummy zombie version again. Right. But that's the best I could figure out. I think that in reality they just couldn't decide which version they wanted to go with.
Yeah, so they just have all 3 women.
There's a scene where the human-looking La Llorona tricks the kids into following her to her haunted manor. With the
really good toys.
There's and they are really good toys.
Yeah, there's really toys inside the house.
And when that doesn't work, she just attacks them as a zombie later that night. They end up trying to bring the gangsters back into it because they're still looking for this treasure too. Mm-hmm. And there's a really funny scene that has Napoles and Santo confront the head gangster after beating up his horde, some of which were flat out killed by La Llorona. Yep. And he just hands the medallion and says, "You can't prove that I stole it." And they don't beat him up or anything. They go, "I guess he's right. We can't prove it." And so they just leave. Yeah. And it might be lazy writing, but it reminded me of something that would actually happen on the Batman show from the 60s, which kind of inspired some of the Santo stuff. Mm-hmm. It feels like, he's right, Robin. We can't take him in. He technically hasn't broken any laws. It just feels like a joke you would have in a Batman episode.
And a sign that mob leaders are no match for Santo, that they just may as well give in or hand over whatever kind of prize or piece of treasure they have to him.
And of course, the second they leave, he calls more thugs in and says, mm-hmm. I have a tracking device, we can go get him. And I also have a note here that there's some real Scooby-Doo energy to the way Santo and Napoles dress. They got these toasty sweaters and bootcut slacks all the time.
Yeah.
Like, I just pictured Santo dressing like a wrestler the whole movie, but he really just has the mask on. I think that I would call this a B movie that is a good mix of cheapness and effort. So it looks like it costs nothing to make, but the cinematographer took time to light things nicely, and there's a spookiness to the horror scenes, which is, I think, the difference between a bad B movie and a good B movie. It's like, well, we don't have all the shots we need, and we've put a lot of way too much time into just showing the wrestling stuff because we have some sort of edict from the producers saying we have to have this many wrestling scenes. And it also does fill space really well.
But yet it ends really quickly. It's tied up. Everything is tied up and completed very quickly because it's like they get the gold, they break the seal of a crypt, they bring the gold doubloons to a children's hospital, and after the evil next door later neighbor La Llorona lady has the children in the house, she's about to kill them. But once the gold changes hands to the people in the hospital, she disappears. The, the, the children are back home watching TV supposedly that same night. They forgot about what happened, and then the movie's done, and they laugh as kind of like, kids, they forget everything.
It is kind of, I did like the fact that they break the curse almost accidentally because they give the gold to charity, which was the plan all along.
Yes. But
It's,
that's what kills her.
yeah, and that's what kills her. And it's not like it was like in another movie it'd be like, quick, we have to give this money to charity or else no, it's just like that was the plan all along. And it's a funny little addition. Oh, I should also say Jose Napoles was a real life boxer from Cuba. This is the only one of these movies he ever appeared in.
As Mantequilla.
As Mantequilla. Yeah, he's so badly dubbed that I don't know how good his performance is, but he does seem kind of awkward, like he's not really ready for it. But he passed away in 2019, and his record is of the most wins in unified championship bouts in boxing history. It's a record he shares with Muhammad Ali.
Nice.
And he remained unbeaten for 40 years. For whatever reason, they decided that the movie version of him is really into ghosts and just wants to see La Llorona, which is kind of cute. This is a pretty typical Santo movie from the other ones I've seen. Again, La Llorona is just sort of slotted into it, which is going to be a theme in the next thing we're going to talk about too. Okay, so then we'll move on. We'll cut ahead many years to 2006 for Kilometer 31, Kilometer 31, sometimes shortened to KM31. This is written and directed by Rigoberto Castañeda. I was trying to find, like I said, there were a million La Llorona movies now from Mexico and America that all seem to be these low-budget interchangeable. I can't tell one from the other. Picked this one because if the reviews are any indication, well, you wanted to cover it because you sounded interested in it too.
Yes.
But to me, the reviews indicate that this was a big deal upon release and hailed as like the return of Mexican horror. So even though the reviews are generally negative, it seems like it was a sort of revitalization for the genre in the area, at least in terms of money. And then if we really want to just quickly say, the first in this ongoing post-millennial La Llorona cycle was a movie called Las Lloronas from 2004. And then it was preceded by a movie called The Wailer, which was also popular and had a sequel. So I think we could have either done The Wailer or Kilometer 31. They both seem to have had sort of an impact. This, to me, felt like an attempt to upgrade their local mainstream horror to match what was happening in the U.S. in the time. And so it feels like a copy of an American copy of a Japanese horror movie.
Exactly, yeah.
And it was co-produced by Spaniards, so it also has some similarities to the early mid-aught Spanish horror movies that made their way over here, like The Orphanage.
Yes.
Stylistically, not really thematically.
And I remember telling you while watching this, it looked like Twilight.
Yeah. Well, it looked like Twilight, and it also tonally reminded me. I mean, there's a lot of the Ring and the Grudge remakes in here, but there's also like the Mothman prophecies.
Yes.
It has a lot of that look, and Juan Baguero's Darkness. Well, he was a Spanish director, and that was his Hollywood movie that didn't do too well. It had Anna Paquin in it,
Oh.
but like a lot of this movie feels like a Mad Lib for what movies were supposed to look like in the mid 2000s, what horror movies were supposed to look like in the mid 2000s.
Black, blues, sort of wet, perpetual nights. Yeah.
Spooky Children.
Spooky children.
I would say this one would probably be an R-rated movie in the US, but it's really close to that PG-13. There was just like they wanted to get that hard PG-13 at the time. Creepy VHS video scenes.
Yes.
And communication from the other side through the snow on the television, which I know is a poltergeist thing, but it really feels like it came back because of Ring.
And then like sisters kind of like sharing the same dream, even though one of them is in a coma and one of them is waking up from her actual sleep.
Yeah, and then also the obsessive gruff cop who's trying to solve the case, like secretly. Yeah. There's like character. Sometimes he's like a religious person. Sometimes he's just like the father of a victim. But that character's in all those movies too. And then long, creepy black hair becomes an issue later. So yeah, basically a little bit of everything you expect from these movies.
I think where they pull from Llorona is, this is the first one, I think maybe even the only one, no, that's a lie, the next one does it too, where it's the return to, oh, she drowns.
Yeah, and so I'm wondering if, because you have the 1980s and 90s between these movies, I'm wondering if that part really did, because we were, born in the 80s. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if the Americanization of the lore, where it became she drowned her children, really soaked the entirety of the lore in other countries, because a lot of versions, even the ones we didn't watch, I looked into, and a lot of them involve drowning and water being sort of the spirit's place of power.
Conduit.
It's like a whole, it becomes a whole thing at this point. So I think that maybe while we were hearing the story, the idea of the story was changing a lot.
Yes.
And the Mexican American version of it started becoming the more popular version of the story. Mm-hmm. At the same time, this feels like a movie about highway ghosts that they realized they wanted to localize. And so they kind of crammed La Llorona into highway ghosts. And it's really convoluted thing about how the river where her children were drowned is under the highway.
Yes.
And it's almost forgotten at certain points. It really is another one of these movies that feels like two different movies kind of crammed together. They also, the part where I was told as a kid that she specifically will walk around canals and washes looking for kids to drown, that's sort of implied in this one too.
Yes.
But again, more important is the haunted kilometer marker. So at the beginning of the movie, this woman is going to visit her sister, and she seems to have, they never say, but she seems to have had some sort of argument with her boyfriend or something. Like it's not going to be good news to go visit the sister. Mm-hmm. And she hits a child, a spooky child on the road, and goes out to see the body, and then gets hit by a car herself. Yes. And so my assumption, and I don't know if it was yours too, is that this is what these drowned children do, is that they do this. But what we later find out in the movie is basically whoever's just been killed then has to do the same thing. It's sort of like a trap where the previous victim has to then become the next spirit in that area, which separates it from La Llorona even more.
It's like a chain of sacrifice.
Yeah. Which is a cool idea, I like this sort of circular, it's something I like about Japanese ghost stories a lot, is they kind of get stuck in patterns, and if you get the curse, then you're stuck in the same pattern as them. I like that idea. It's a horrible thought that in your afterlife is spent not just doing the same thing over and over again, but doing someone else's job.
And closing your circle to get to somebody else.
So it's a neat idea, and then they introduce this other aspect that her and her sister, who aren't twins.
No,
They say one's
they
older.
say, they're identical. They do everything the same.
But they're not twins, even though they're identical. They have a psychic bond.
Right.
Which you did sort of just say earlier, but yes, they have a psychic bond.
So much so that when the one sister dies, the other sister is like, something happened. I need to go out, and so she physically runs out to this kilometer 31 and finds her body and just cries, and she's very upset.
Technically, the sister doesn't die; she goes into a coma,
which loses both her legs.
Yeah, and loses both her legs, which becomes another plot point. Like, it feels like it's a different movie. It kind of reminded me of the Australian horror movie Patrick, which is about someone in a coma who's taking revenge on the people. It's sort of like Carrie. What if Carrie was a dude in a coma instead of... And it feels like something different, but I think that this was their version of Kim Ji-woon's Korean horror film A Tale of Two Sisters, which you haven't seen, but you saw the scary scene from when we were watching the Shudder 100.
Scariest movie moment.
Yeah, which is probably the best Korean horror film, at least ghost story, at least that I've seen. It reminded me of the idea so much that I kept on waiting for the same twist to happen. So I knew that they were setting up some kind of twist, just because it was that was the era of where Hollywood horror movies always had a twist of some kind because of Sixth Sense. But it actually got me. It actually messed me up because I spent the movie, and I don't want to totally ruin Tale of Two Sisters, but I have the idea is that one of them's been dead the whole time.
Oh.
So I kept on trying to connect, one of these sisters is dead, but then people would refer to both of them.
Yep.
And so I'm like, well, that can't be it. But then they also have another subplot where the two boyfriends who don't like each other start confusing them.
Yeah, and like, the sister who's in the coma is Agatha, and the one who is alive is Catalina.
That sounds right.
And Agatha's boyfriend that's the Nuno, the other Nuno of these Llorona movies. He says to either the boyfriend, he communicates with the boyfriend that I have a hard time showing emotions, and one time I knew I switched up the sisters. I made love with Agatha, knowing that she was Agatha, and I found that I could express myself to her and tell her things that I would never like say out loud. And that's when Catalina's boyfriend Omar says, now that you mentioned that, I don't know anything about Catalina because she doesn't say anything about her family or where she's from or talk about what happened to her mom.
And so that really does make it seem like only one of them exists.
Yes.
But that doesn't happen.
And I thought that was going to happen in that kind of like movie that they watch about their birthdays.
Yeah.
But no, it's just...
Well, and it's also the fact that the one in the coma is haunting the other one, which I hate to keep belaboring the point, but that could have made a fine horror movie by itself. You didn't need the haunted highway or La Llorona elements. No. Or you could have just had the La Llorona elements deal with the fact that their mother killed herself and tried to drown them, is I think with the idea. So they keep implying in flashbacks that different things happened.
And there's a good sister and there's a bad sister.
Yeah.
And there was a sister that took care of their mother, and there was a sister that wanted to kill the mother.
Right, so the first flashback is... Or actually, it's not even a flashback, it's first... Splashback. It's actually a story she tells, it's not a flashback. She says that she had a schizophrenic mother who took the wrong pills and tried to drown herself while they were still kids. Mm-hmm. And then in an actual flashback, it's sort of, or did she? No, the girls drowned their own mother. Or did they? Yeah. So it is really fishing for a twist, the whole movie. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't quite deliver on any of these ideas. I can see why a lot of the reviews are really frustrated because it's trying to be so many things at once. And it really just needs to focus on something, because then it suddenly really becomes a full-bore La Llorona movie.
because of Catalina going to this older woman who doesn't really exist, and she immediately reminded me of the witch sister in the Sleepy Hollow film.
Mm-hmm.
Because she sets a fire in the fireplace, she talks to Catalina about why she's here, and there's things that she doesn't understand, and that there is a Mexican woman who was impregnated by a Spanish man in order to have the kids that his wife wouldn't have with him. But yet he doesn't want to acknowledge these kids.
Yeah, so it's that version. It's that mixed version where it's not that the child was taken away from the indigenous woman, but that she was foolish to try to trust this colonizer man.
So she wants to kill his kids.
Yeah.
And herself.
And it ends up being that then, because they've introduced this as a regular La Llorona kind of movie, it actually disentangles that from the characters. It's this other thing. Whereas if it was just sort of like the theme of La Llorona applied to their mom and their upbringing, it would have been more satisfying, I think.
But I think it kind of takes a different route where Agata's death was needed to continue the circle, and now she has the curse even though she's in a coma.
Right. It just, by introducing the real story, I always feel like, I don't know, it felt like it didn't need to acknowledge the legend as directly as it did. And then we're not going to get to it yet, but the last one we were going to talk about does, I think, a perfect job of introducing just as much of that legend as it needs and updating it. Yes. Whereas this was trying to have it both ways, an updated version.
Several different ways.
Yeah. And so it just doesn't work. There's an annoying love triangle then that comes up between but they just keep ending storylines. So love triangles ended because one of the boyfriends just dies investigating shit.
And then he leads Catalina to his own body.
That's true. That's the one purpose he serves, is that he goes into the sort of ghost loop, but does the right thing and says, "Hey, don't." And then she learns. And it is sort of an interesting thing where they keep ending up at the same hospital over and over again. Right. I kind of like that idea that they keep getting into accidents in the exact same mile marker and ending up at the exact same hospital in different situations. And in one case, the other boyfriend has hit somebody who's already been dead. Yes. But he's in the hospital because he hurt himself and because he's insane with grief because he thinks he's killed someone. So there's a lot of interesting ideas that are wrapped into this movie that just keep ending before they do it. There's even a part really early on where there's a bunch of people in the hospital and we don't even know who they are, but they're all worried in the waiting room, and the camera follows them, and we have the ghost sort of whispering to them in a way that I don't know if they're supposed to be able to hear it, but they're whispering to. She's like trying to tell them the what they need to hear about their loved ones.
Oh, right.
And so I thought it was going to set up a ghost versus ghost situation where there's one bad ghost and one ghost that is sort of that wants to help people and usher them through the afterlife and stuff. But so I was like, oh, the girl in the coma is going to be the good ghost, and no, she's just a pawn of the whole thing. Really creepy scene where she comes out of the water in the sewer at the end. It all just builds up to this chase scene in the sewers that doesn't really do much, but there is some creepy imagery in those.
And then the sister kind of comes up out of her coma at the very, very end.
Yeah. But yeah, again, I go back to the Mad Lib thing where it just feels like they had a list of the things that have to happen in a early millennial horror ghost story. And they just wanted it to seem as much like an American film as possible while still having a little bit of Mexican flavor. Yeah. The best I can say is that it has good ideas that it doesn't really pull it together. I guess that's just where I come down to. I don't know if you have anything else about the themes here. So I'll just say the one little factoid on IMDb is apparently the movie is popular enough that Mexicans started flocking to the actual highway marker on El Desierto de los Leones. It's a real highway and a real highway marker. I don't know if they filmed it at the exact spot, but it's at least a real place you can go.
It's like a national park where there's like supposed volcanic activity as well.
And then the movie fan in me, horror movie fan, the climax has the whole subway horror element going on.
Yeah, there's like a tunnel.
again, I don't think it needed it, but there's a reveal that the song the little ghost boy has been singing the whole movie is the subway's clock alarm. Or get on, it's like the alarm that sounds when you need to get on when the subway and the car's coming in. And so the ghost hears this song, and that's all he can really do is hum this song. And that reminded me of, there's a really great horror movie. It takes place in the UK. I believe it's an American filmmaker called Raw Meat, where there's been these inbred cannibals for generations. They've just been stuck. Well, they could build this thing, and then these people were stuck, and they've been inbred. And the guy, he only can say, "Mind the doors." Mind the doors! It's because he hears that all the time because he lives in the subway. Which then I was like, oh, the Hodor thing in Game of Thrones ripped off Raw Meat. I don't know, not a good movie, but...
Too much going on.
And it had a sequel, and we didn't watch it, but I can't imagine where it went. It had to be a different group of people.
I hope so.
It had to be one of those horror movies where they just, let's do the same thing again with a different group of people.
They wouldn't have the coma sister appear again.
I don't think they would, but I don't know. Maybe they did. Maybe someone...
the same hospital.
Maybe someone can jump on my website, genregrinder.com, and tell us, oh, no, this happens. You know, I don't really plan on watching it. And like I said, I don't plan on watching most of these movies because most of them sound like they were thrown together.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to talk about La Llorona of 2019 as the last thing. And this was written and directed by Jayro Bustamante. This is Guatemalan, and it follows a Guatemalan version of the story, which is very close to the earliest indigenous version of the story we know. But I have to specify that there were 5 movies with La Llorona in the title released in 2019. There was a short-form animated one made to raise awareness for femicide in Mexico, which you can watch on Vimeo, by Adriana Ronquillo. There was a major studio release by Michael Chavez called The Curse of La Llorona, which was part of the Conjuring verse, which we almost watched, but we just didn't. There was a short, I believe, mockbuster one that was cashing in on that one called The La Llorona Curse, which is very funny to me because translated, that's the Curse of the Crying Woman. That director, Damir Katic, has only one other movie period to his credit, and it was from 2013, and it's called Her Cry, La Llorona Investigation. So he's only done 2 movies his whole life, and they were both La Llorona horror movies in the 2010s. And then there was a second, even lower budget cash-in called The Haunting of La Llorona, and that one was done by Dennis Devine, the man behind the shot-on-video classic Fatal Images, which we cover in our Genre Grinder shot-on-video horror series. This movie is so thematically rich and so new that I do want to be a little cautious of spoilers. And the fact that I think that we just watched this a couple days ago. Yeah. And I mean, I could think about it for another couple days and I probably think up some new things or find a good article on it or something. So this is sort of we're going to be a little more Cliff Notes about this one is my thought here.
Okay.
But it is such a great movie. Mm-hmm. It's easily the best La Llorona movie we watched.
Yes.
And it's another one that, in a lot of ways, it isn't a horror movie until the end.
Although, like, horrific things happen.
Yeah. Frankie, don't nuzzle the microphone, please. And so, and then I want to preface this one other thing, is that there's a long history about horror movies that are secretly or not so secretly about something else, usually political or social. Mm-hmm. The horror is the text, the politics is the subtext. Dawn of the Dead is a movie about zombies in a mall, but it's also a movie about consumerism. There's a bunch of 70s horror movies that are really about the Vietnam War. There's a bunch of 2000s horror movies that are about the Iraq and Afghan War. We still have movies like this. Jordan Peele makes them. A horror movie about one thing that's really underneath that about something else. Mm-hmm. But more recently, there are a number of movies that are dramatic portrayals of a thing, usually political, historical, or emotionally, thematic, in which a horror element is introduced. So the theme is the text, not the subtext. Mm-hmm. The horror becomes more literal rather than metaphorical. Mm-hmm. So my examples of this are Remy Weeks's His House, which is about Sudan refugees in the UK who are haunted by ghosts of the mistake they made while escaping their country. So it is not secretly about Sudan refugees living in the UK and how hard that is. It's a movie about that also has horror. Um, and then Natalie Erica James's The Relic is about a woman whose Alzheimer's or dementia bleeds into her house and haunts her daughter and granddaughter. So it is literally a movie about dementia and how you deal with the death of a loved one that adds horror elements. So it's kind of just the opposite of what, and I think that's interesting that we have both these types of movies and how horror movies are interested in. Here's the subject. Now we're going to introduce horror instead of here's the horror movie, but it's secretly about blah. So this is a case of that. This is a movie that is a drama about an aging white political criminal and his privileged offspring who are dealing with long gestating fallout of decades-old genocides of indigenous people. It's about his trial and the way the protests affect his life, and the wife of his wife, who's a true believer in him, and his daughter, who is much more liberal-minded and kind of trapped in this situation where she's super privileged and wealthy and knows that she can't really make, like her best option is to shut the fuck up, but she does want to be a part of it. And the granddaughter, who is so separated from all of it that she's genuinely innocent. Mm-hmm. That's what the movie's about. And then they introduce the horror element.
Correct.
Which is, I think a really nice way of doing this.
Mm-hmm. And it's another, like, really intensive repeating theme of the other films where the service staff and the household staff have a very important part to play.
Yeah, and so early in the movie, when things start going down and there's, I mean, basically the entire plot of the movie, other than the trial parts, which are pretty short, is that the family can't leave their home because the protests are sometimes violent. They throw rocks with
have you seen them posters?
Yeah, posters of missing people, and one of the ghostly elements that introduced early on is that the daughter and granddaughter are looking at these posters and start to notice the people are in the crowd outside, which is a cool ghost story thing, and so these people have the idea being these people were killed during the genocide, and they're part of the protest against this man. But so the scary part of the movie is that these people are trapped in their house and they're trying to just pretend to just go on with their lives, but they're being haunted at the same time.
There's a household staff changeover where they're on one hand seen as turncoat savages for leaving their position when the family most needs them, and then seemingly a protester comes out of the woodwork, knocks on their door, and she's deemed as the new maid, Alma. So she wants to help out the family while they're being protested against.
And so there's really only two. There's like the head maid,
Valencia,
and who is sort of in place of that character in the last movie who tells the whole backstory. So she's someone who still practices the old ways.
Yes. And speaks the dialect.
Speaks the dialect, and this one other woman who, everybody else leaves because they're disgusted by the situation and they don't want to be seen as traitors. The dictator himself might be suffering dementia. He's very old. Mm-hmm. It's either he's suffering dementia or he's being haunted. He is sort of surrounded by trophies of oppression. He's got badges and military awards and guns, and none of it can do anything to protect them because they can't leave their house, and a ghost has infiltrated.
And then it's like, can I say it without spoiling things? Both the general and his wife are under the they have very intensive dreams.
Right. His are more hallucinations, like dream walking, or sleepwalking.
Yeah. And find the source of someone crying or where the running water is coming from, and being threatened by something that he needs to pull a gun on, and he needs access to his guns in order to protect his family.
And so twice he hurts people who are family members with guns because he's just shooting blindly at everything he's afraid of.
And then the grandmother, meanwhile, has dreams of being a woman who's protecting her children from guerrilla warfare people or from the general's force.
Yeah, she is one of the women involved in this genocide that is being done under the guise of looking for communist infiltrators. Yeah, and so she's sort of put directly in their shoes while he's haunted by his own violence, is the way I kind of looked at it.
Yeah. Something that really hit home for me was when she was hiding with her children in the cornfield and she's very visibly scared, is that the soldiers around her, they were kind of pursuing her. They were whistling. And whistling is a very it comes up pretty often if you're a woman somewhere alone by yourself, like walking on a street or trying to not be seen by someone. If you hear a man whistling at you, it's an immediate threat.
It's both a threat to women and it's really a sign of disrespect in the context of a genocide like that. It's treating them like dogs or animals.
Correct.
Yeah, it is a good scary. Well, audio is a great scary element throughout the movie, because the din of the protests never stop. They go to a different room, so it changes. It sounds more muffled, or if they're outside, it's louder. But they're surrounded by anger the entire movie.
And there's like chants, there's like
Drums,
music.
yeah. There's a cool twist on the La Llorona myth that happens later that I don't want to spoil. But they have an interesting thing where they take the idea from the earlier movies where La Llorona appears as a caretaker for the children, and they turn that on its head, because drowning her and her like sort of power she gets from water, and the fact that she's involving the child in water so much, it feels like, well, okay, I'll say this. This is a movie that if it wasn't called La Llorona, it could be called anything really.
Yes.
But by calling it La Llorona, the people who are in the know understand your point.
Yes.
So you don't actually need to go into a lot of specifics of the La Llorona. They do eventually, but it's kind of a cool idea that if someone's never heard of La Llorona and watches this movie, they'll have no idea what's going on. And then suddenly there'll be all these ghost things and it'll be all new to him. But those of us who are like, this political drama is called La Llorona, we understand, I thought that's a cool thing to have the title tell you that much. It's kind of like the movie The Howling. The majority of the film has nothing to early parts of the film. It's setting up like a serial killer, and an event, but it's called The Howling, so you know that the werewolves are going to show up eventually. It's kind of that situation. I think it's really special.
I think again, this is probably something that it's not quite giving everything away. I think people who are in the know about La Llorona and the other members of the audience who know nothing about it, I think they can both mutually agree that they don't know if the granddaughter really loving the maid is going to be a good thing or a bad thing.
Right, and I think that's a really good idea. It's a twist on the narrative that doesn't try to be a sort of plot twist. It's not a plot twist. It's a twist on a narrative that we know. It's a twist on a legend. And I think that's another very clever thing for them to do, and makes sense with the context of the story. The element of the La Llorona legend that often doesn't make sense or doesn't really jibe, I guess, is the idea that someone who killed their child and feels bad about it would then continue killing children. It's an interesting idea. But yeah, it's a really good movie. It's on Shudder. It's been on Shudder for a while, so I'm guessing they'll keep it for a while. And they just announced a Criterion Blu-ray not too long ago as of this recording. Yeah, it's available to watch. Some of these are hard to find. You gotta dig for them on YouTube. And like I said, we could have covered several dozen movies from the recent years, but I don't think any of them were going to be as good and satisfying as this was.
True.
Do you have anything else about any of these or the legend of La Llorona in general?
No.
Okay, well then, I don't know a lot about Mexican horror. Grew up near it. I know a lot about Mexican culture, Dia de los Muertos, all that stuff, but just haven't watched very many Mexican horror movies, so it was a good excuse to watch some.
And it's a good way for me to revisit the conflict essentially inside of me my Spanish conquistador side, my Mexican side, and my white side.
If you want to get a hold of me, I am on, we got my Genre Grinder website. We got Genre Grinder on Twitter, assuming that Twitter, I don't know, as of this recording, it still exists.
You don't have a blue check to maintain. I think you're...
Well, it just seems like things are going really bad for the... Anyway, I don't know. I don't have an Instagram at this point, but maybe by the time the next one comes out, I'll end up having to do that. But the Genre Grinder Facebook is up and working just fine.
Yep.
And you can also reach me at Gabe M as in Matthew Powers on Twitter. Is there anywhere you can be bothered, Kristine?
I think if people want to bother me, they can bother me through you.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, and until next time, don't go near suspicious women walking alongside suspicious bodies of water, especially if they're hollering for their dead children.
Easy. Oh. Also, Black Lives Matter, and get out and vote.
All right, bye-bye.